we as humans are so resistant to change, and the book kind of explains those reasons and ways that we can get around it. One of the things, though, I'm curious about is what is the psychological reason that, as you kind of used with your chair analogy, that someone tries to push us and we push back? I mean, is this some super subconscious, part of our brain that's focused on self-preservation? And if we just keep on going the same way, or if someone tells us to go right, we inevitably want to go left? Where does all this kind of come from a psychological root level?
Yeah, and you mentioned the framework. And so, as you mentioned the word reduce, there's sort of 5 key barriers: reactance, endowment, distance, uncertainty, and corroborating evidence. And I think the first barrier is really exactly what you mentioned, right? When we push people, they push back. And the reason, very simply, is people like to have freedom or control, or perceive freedom or control over their life. They like to think that they're in the driver's seat. Why did I make a certain choice? Why did I buy a certain product? Why did I support a certain initiative? Because I wanted to, because I like it, because it's what I wanted to do. But the problem is, when we ask someone to do something, or we encourage someone to do something, it impinges on that ability for them to see their behavior as driven by themselves. In a sense, people have an almost anti-persuasion radar, an innate system that recognizes when someone's trying to persuade them. Think about like an anti-missile defense system. When they detect an incoming projectile, the defenses go up and they shoot it down, whether that's avoiding or ignoring the message. So, walking out of the room when an ad comes on, scrolling past something on social media if a company is being a little too pitchy in their content, or even worse, counter arguing. Right? We make a post, for example, that says, "Hey, this new truck is great for these reasons." Someone's sitting there going, "Well, of course you'd say that. You're selling that truck, right? Of course you'd say it's good. Of course you focus on the features that are good, but you ignore the other ones." Almost like a high school debate student, right? Sitting there thinking about all the reasons why you're wrong. And so, unfortunately, when we try to get someone to do something, they push back. And so pushing it by itself isn't going to work. We have to reduce that reactance and figure out a way to make them feel less like we're in control, and make them feel like they're more in control.
Jonah, you have 5 key barriers that use the acronym REDUCE. And we've talked a little bit about the first one, reduce reactance. I call it kind of the Newton's third law of motion, and
Yeah.
how, and you articulate in your book kind of how to manage that. The second one is endowment, reduce endowment. What I kind of call the over attachment to status quo, where people are saying, well, I've been doing it this way for 20 years. I'm not going to change. Talk a little bit about kind of how the brain kind of perceives that, and how we as marketers and as communicators can overcome that.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about change is you're not just trying to tell people how good something is, you're trying to get them to get rid of something that's old. And that's often something we overlook. And, depending on time, we may get to uncertainty and talk a little about how people are scared of new things. But as you nicely mentioned, they're not just scared of new things, they're often overly attached to old things. There's research on something called the endowment effect, for example, that says that we value stuff that we're already doing or using more than stuff we aren't. So imagine I showed you a coffee mug, for example, plain white coffee mug. I said, "Hey, it holds coffee, it holds tea. How much would you pay for this coffee mug?" You'd probably go $2, $3, something like that. Well, if instead I said, "Hey, let me give you this coffee mug. It's now yours. You can check it out, use it if you like. By the way, how much would you sell it for?" Most people would say, well, $7, $8, often 2 to 3 times what they'd be willing to pay to buy it. Same coffee mug, but the fact that they're already doing it makes them value it more. Right? If you look at home buyers, for example, or home sellers, people who've lived in a home, the longer they've lived in the home, the more they value that home, even above and beyond market price. The challenge is that we become attached to the old way of doing things, whether it's the old way of doing marketing, whether it's the old product or service that we've been using in the past. And so it's really hard to get people to let go of old things. And so one thing I talk about in that chapter is how can we ease endowment, in some sense, by making it clear that the status quo isn't costless. Often we end up sticking with things in the past because we think they're safe. I'm already doing this thing. There's no risk in doing it. I've done it before. It's the old way of doing things. It's got to work, right? But often old things aren't as costless as we might think they are. And so I talk about a few strategies to mitigate that. One is just to surface the costs of an action. There's a great piece of research that shows, it asks people, hey, what do you think is more painful over the course of your life? What's more painful, a major injury or a minor injury? Of course, everyone says, well, major injury, I break my elbow, it's going to be much more painful than spraining my elbow. I break my finger, much more painful than spraining my finger. And so you think these major injuries are more painful, but it ends up that minor injuries are more painful because major injuries get fixed and minor ones don't. If things are just below the threshold, we don't necessarily take the action to get them fixed. Oh, it's good enough. Sure, that old way of doing things isn't perfect. It's a minor injury, but it's not big enough that it's worth fixing. And so part of the idea of surfacing the cost of an action is making it clear that it's not just a minor one, it's actually a major one.
One thing that you talked about in the book is the third letter in the mnemonic D, distance. I think this is particularly germane to our audience, Jonah. You posit in this book that communications can actually increase opposition. Now, that is counterfactual to many professional communicators who feel like the more that we create content marketing or the more we create informative social media, that surely we are chipping away at people's opposition over time. But you demonstrate in the book that is actually, in some cases, not all cases, not true, and actually communicating more actually sells less.
Yeah, so there's a great study done by a friend and colleague of mine at Duke University. He's a sociologist, where he said, hey, could we help political polarization? So obviously political polarization is a huge issue in the United States. Democrats hate Republicans, Republicans hate Democrats. Everyone doesn't talk about politics at Thanksgiving dinner. The solution people propose is just as you said, information. If people just had more information about the other side, not even persuasion, but just had more information, they'd come around. Right? If we could just cross the barrier, if we could just bridge the divide, if people just stepped across the aisle, it would be better. And so he did this great study with Twitter where he got about 1,500 different people to follow a bot from the other side. So if you're a Democrat, you'd follow a bot sharing Republican information. If you're Republican, you'd follow a bot sharing Democratic information. No persuasion, just information from the other side, with the notion that, hey, if people could see the other side's perspective, they'd come around. Now, the study cost a bunch of money, it took a huge amount of time, and at the end, he measured, hey, did people's attitudes change? Did people become more moderate in their views? And the hope was that they would become more moderate, but that's not what he found. And he also didn't find that the information had no effect. It, in fact, had the exact opposite effect. It made Democrats slightly more liberal, and it made Republicans significantly more conservative. And part of the reason why is, in some sense, people on a football field. Pick any dimension. Start with politics is easy to think about. There's one end of the field that's Democrats, the other end of the field are Republicans, and in between are people that are different levels of more and less moderate. And around someone's view, there's a region of beliefs that they'll consider. Yeah, a little more liberal, a little more conservative, maybe they'll consider that. But something too far from where they are at the moment often falls in the region of rejection. Too far away, I won't even consider it. And that's what happened here, right? That information was so far away from where people were at the moment, it fell in that region of rejection, people discounted it, and actually became more polarized as a result. And so the question is, well, how can we then reduce that distance or shrink that distance and make it less impactful?
So talk a little bit about corroborating evidence and how we make sure that we are sharing the right evidence at the right time for that particular individual.
Yeah, so some change is relatively easy, right? If you send someone a link to an article online, they're probably going to click on it if they know you. If you're their friend, they'll check it out. But some things are more difficult to change. We can think about sort of pebbles and boulders, right? A pebble is easy. You give it a little push, it moves. A boulder's a little bit harder, right? It's one thing to get someone to buy, I don't know, a $9 stapler. It's another thing to convince them to do a $9 million digital transformation. Something is more risky, more expensive, more controversial, anything like that that's going to require sort of more proof or more evidence, just like your English teacher might have said, for people to be willing to do it. But there's a problem when we try to provide that evidence. And so often we say, okay, something needs more proof. I'll just give you more proof. No problem. Hey, you need more evidence. This is a good idea. I'll give you more evidence. But imagine someone comes to you and they say, hey, I love this new TV show. You should check it out. They've just put a little bit of proof on that sort of scale. And if that thing is more of a pebble, it's a move and it'll get you to watch the TV show. But imagine that's not enough. Imagine it's more of a boulder, requires a little bit more effort. Okay, so the person comes back next week and they say, hey, I still like that TV show. I watched the second episode. It's still good. You really like it. In some sense, that's more proof. But in another sense, it's not. Because anytime one person tells you something, you're always dealing with what's called the translation problem. You're trying to figure out whether what that person said provides evidence about something or provides evidence about them. Sure, that person liked the television show, but does that mean that that show is really good? Or does that mean that person likes all shows? And even more broadly, sure, they like it, but what does that mean about whether I will like it or not? And so even if that second person comes back again and again and provides more information, it still doesn't tell you more about whether you'll like it. It just provides more information that they'll like it. And so in some sense, providing more proof can't be something always we do by ourselves. Sometimes we need other people. There's a great old saying or proverb that goes, when one person says you have a tail, you laugh. When 5 people say you have a tail, you turn around to take a look. And that's basically the idea of corroborating evidence. Sometimes we can't provide more evidence ourselves. We can tell someone they have a tail till we're blue in the face. They're not going to believe us. They'll think we're crazy. But if 5 people, 3 people, 2 people say the same thing at a close enough period of time, it's much more likely to drive change.